Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're tackling something massive, breaking down the incredibly monumental task of building India's economy from absolute scratch. Imagine, just for a second, waking up on August 15th, 1947. After a couple hundred years of British rule, the destiny of this huge, incredibly diverse nation is suddenly in its own hands. The task ahead wasn't just about political freedom, it was about designing a system that could actually lift millions out of poverty and promote welfare for everybody, not just a privileged few. So, with the British gone, we had a massive question right out of the gate. How on earth do you build an economy entirely from scratch? Well, every society has to answer three basic questions. What goods and services should be produced? How should they be produced? And how should they be distributed among the people? The answers to those three questions form the very bedrock of a nation's future. To figure that out, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll look at choosing an economic path, the goals of the 5-year plans, fixing stagnant agriculture, the green revolution, and finally, we'll wrap up with the subsidy debate. Let's get right into it. Starting with part 1, choosing an economic path and finding the right system. Back then, leaders were looking at two polar opposite models. On one side, pure capitalism, or a totally free market economy. Here, things are produced entirely based on market demand and purchasing power. But here's the reality check. The vast majority of people in newly independent India were incredibly poor. They simply didn't have the cash to create market demand for basics, like low-cost housing or healthcare. Pure capitalism would have literally just left them behind. Now, on the flip side, you had the strict socialism seen in the former Soviet Union. No private property at all. The government owns all the factories, all the farms, and decides exactly what everyone needs. So what do? Well, you find a middle ground. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru actually sympathized deeply with socialist ideals. But in a democracy, you can't exactly just strip citizens of their land and property overnight like the Soviets did. The solution? A mixed economy. It was a brilliantly pragmatic move. The government steps in to plan and provide those essential services the market ignores for the poor, but, and this is key, you still keep a vibrant private sector and private property to help drive the nation's growth. Moving on to Section 2, the goals of the 5-year plans, which was really their grand strategy. Take a look at this quote from the first 5-year plan. It says the goal is to initiate a process of development which will raise the living standards and open out to the people new opportunities. I absolutely love this because it reminds us that this wasn't just cold, hard economics. It gives a real voice to the core human desire to actually improve the daily lived experiences of Indian citizens and offer them a richer life. To make that richer life a reality, planners built their strategy on 4 main pillars. First up, growth. Basically, just increasing the capacity to produce stuff. Second, modernization. This meant adopting new tech, but also, and this is super important, adopting progressive social outlooks, like acknowledging that women should absolutely be working in banks and factories, not just staying at home. Third was self-reliance. This was huge. India wanted to stop relying on imports, especially food, to protect its hard-won sovereignty from outside interference. And fourth, equity. Because, look, if you have crazy high growth and shiny new tech, but only the ultra-rich actually benefit, the whole plan is a bust. Planners had the almost impossible job of balancing these 4 goals, which honestly bumped heads sometimes. Like bringing in fancy modern machines could actually hurt your employment goals by replacing human labor. Let's make that first pillar, growth, a bit more tangible. Think of the gross domestic product, or GDP, as a giant cake. The GDP is simply the market value of all final goods and services produced in the country in a year. Economic growth, that's literally just baking a bigger cake. A larger cake means there are fundamentally more slices, more goods and services for the people of India to enjoy. But getting that cake to rise meant they had to fix some pretty broken ingredients first. Which brings us to Section 3, fixing stagnant agriculture and putting boots on the ground. In 1947, a staggering 75% of the country worked in agriculture. So if you're going to improve India, you have to start in the dirt. And honestly, the dirt was in bad shape. They inherited an incredibly stagnant system. Productivity was just abysmally low because they lacked basic technology and infrastructure. Farmers were totally at the mercy of unpredictable monsoons, and the whole system was bottlenecked by middlemen, like the zamindars. These were wealthy landlords who basically just collected rent and gave absolutely nothing back to the land. It was so bad that this massive, fertile nation was actually forced to beg for food imports from the United States just to survive.
To fix this crippling stagnation, the government brought in some radical land reforms aimed at both equity and growth. The big idea? Cut out the middlemen and give land to the tiller, meaning the actual person out there sweating over the crops would finally become the owner. They also set up land ceilings, basically capping the maximum amount of land any one person could own, just to break up those massive, unfair monopolies of property.
And here is exactly why ownership matters so much. Think of this Soviet fruit analogy. Back in the USSR, farmers would routinely pack rotten fruit right into the same box as the fresh stuff, spoiling the whole batch. Why would they do something so counterproductive? Simple. They didn't own the land. They didn't get the profit if it sold well, and they didn't take the hit if it rotted. No ownership means zero incentive to be efficient. Indian planners totally understood this. If you want farmers to actually invest and boost output, you absolutely have to give them ownership.
Now, the theory was sound, but the actual execution, yeah, it got pretty messy. They did manage to bring about 20 million tenants into direct contact with the government, which is a huge win. But outside of really committed states like Kerala and West Bengal, these reforms hit massive roadblocks. Big landlords just gamed the system. They dragged the new laws through the courts to stall them. They secretly registered huge estates under their relatives' names and illegally kicked out tenants, falsely claiming they were farming the land themselves. And the tragic part is the absolute poorest agricultural laborers usually ended up getting no land at all. Let's move to Section 4, the Green Revolution, which was a massive technological leap.
Take a look at this political cartoon from the era. It perfectly captures the vibe. You see this stark contrast, from basically surviving on American peel for 80 wheat bags to a proud Indian farmer on a tractor surrounded by tall crops. This visual just completely nails the dramatic transformation. India was finally shaking off that vulnerability of foreign dependency and stepping into true self-sufficiency. So, what was the secret weapon here? It was the HYV, or high-yielding variety seed. We're talking literal miracle seeds for wheat and rice. But there was a major catch. You couldn't just toss these in the dirt and pray for rain. They were incredibly demanding. They needed highly specific, regular watering, plus exact doses of chemical fertilizers and pesticides. Without the money for those inputs, or if the water dried up, these miracle crops would fail spectacularly, making them super vulnerable to pest attacks. Because these seeds were so high maintenance, the Green Revolution actually rolled out in two distinct phases. Phase 1, from the mid-60s to the mid-70s, was mostly restricted to the wealthier states that already had reliable irrigation setups, places like Punjab, Andhra Pradesh, and Tamil Nadu. And early on, it really mostly just benefited wheat. But then in Phase 2, stretching into the 1980s, things really took off. The HYV tech spread to a ton of other states and started supercharging a much wider variety of crops across the whole country. Now, keep in mind, growing more food only helps the wider economy if the farmers actually sell it. If they just eat it all themselves, the country is still starving, right? Well, the Green Revolution created such massive yields that it generated a huge marketed surplus, meaning a ton of extra produce was actually sold in the market. This flood of food supply successfully drove down the relative price of grains, and that was a massive win for equity. Think about the low-income folks in the cities who spend a huge chunk of their income on food. They directly benefited from these cheaper prices, while the government was finally able to build up emergency buffer stocks. And that leads us right into Section 5, the subsidy debate, and its unintended consequences. Remember how I mentioned those HYV seeds were crazy expensive and risky? Well, to convince farmers to actually take that gamble, the government stepped in with heavy financial subsidies, especially for things like fertilizers. But today, this has sparked a massive, entirely valid debate among economists. Do we keep them or scrap them? On one side, you have folks saying it's time to phase subsidies out. The technology is totally proven now. The subsidies are a huge drain on government finances, and honestly, a lot of that money just goes straight to the fertilizer industry and farmers who are already prosperous. But on the flip side, economists argue we absolutely must keep them. Farming in India is still a wildly risky business, totally dependent on climate, and the vast majority of farmers are still living in deep poverty. Yanking away that financial safety net could just destroy them. Both sides are pointing out very real economic realities here. So, as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. In a developing economy, how do you actually balance the very real need to protect millions of poor farmers against the crushing, ongoing financial burden on the state? Looking back at India's foundational journey from 1947 to 1990, we see these incredible technological triumphs and really tough philosophical compromises. But that core challenge? Figuring out how to efficiently bake that economic cake while making sure everybody actually gets a fair slice, well, that remains just as relevant today as it was on day one of independence. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.